In the year 2008, a young man named Julian Buchwald was living a quiet and relatively simple life in a small rural town in southern Australia called Budgeree. Budgeree was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors and life moved at a very slow and predictable pace. Julian was 22 years old and he still lived at home with his parents. His family owned a truly massive property that stretched across 1,200 acres of land. To put that into perspective, 1,200 acres is roughly equivalent to about 2 square miles of land. However, this was not a manicured estate or a flat farming property. The vast majority of this massive acreage consisted of incredibly thick brush, dense forests, and rugged Australian bushland. It was so thick and untamed that for the most part, Julian and his family stayed very close to their actual house. They only went deep into the property on rare occasions. But deep within those woods, hidden away in a clearing that was difficult to reach unless you knew exactly where you were going, there was a beautiful natural waterfall. Periodically, when the weather was nice, the family would make the trek out to visit this waterfall because it was one of the most serene and peaceful spots on their land. Just a short drive north of Budgeree, less than 20 minutes away, was another small rural town called Churchill. In this town lived Julian's girlfriend, 17-year-old Carolyn Watson. Carolyn lived with her parents and was still finishing up her school studies. The young couple had met about 2 years earlier at the local church they both attended. They were both extremely devout Christians, and their faith played a massive role in their daily lives and their relationship. They spent a lot of time together, but they always kept their relationship very traditional and conservative. Their plan was to get married the following year, which would be in 2009, as soon as Carolyn turned 18 and completed her studies. They had discussed their future at length, and both of them were fully committed to waiting until marriage to have any kind of physical intimacy. This was a core belief that they both claimed to hold dear, and their families were very supportive of their relationship and their plans for the future. On Tuesday, March 4th of 2008, Julian and Carolyn decided to plan a special afternoon together. It was a beautiful day, and they thought it would be the perfect opportunity to pack a picnic lunch and drive out to the waterfall on Julian's family property. Early that afternoon, Julian left his house, walked out to the driveway, and hopped into his family car. He drove north to Churchill, pulled up to Carolyn's house, and picked her up. She was excited for the afternoon, and they chatted happily as Julian turned the car around and drove them back toward Budgeree. Once they arrived at his family's massive property, Julian steered the car off the main paved road and onto a narrow, bumpy dirt road that wound deep into the forested area toward the waterfall. As they were driving along this dusty, uneven track, Julian was looking out through the windshield when he spotted something unusual on the side of the road up ahead. It looked like some kind of dead animal or roadkill lying on the shoulder. But as they got closer, Julian noticed that this carcass looked much larger and stranger than any animal he was used to seeing in the area. He stared at it through the side window as the car slowly rolled past the shape. Right after they drove past it, Julian turned to Carolyn and told her that he had just seen some really weird, massive roadkill on the side of the road right back there. Carolyn, who did not really have any interest in looking at dead animals, slowly looked up and turned around to peer out the back window. But by that time, the car had already moved further down the track, and she did not see anything. She shrugged it off, and the two of them did not discuss the strange animal any further. Julian continued driving down the dirt road for a bit longer until the trees suddenly parted and the road opened up into a large, beautiful clearing. In the middle of this clearing was a wide field with a small pond, and feeding into this pond was a 10-foot-high waterfall. This was the spot they had been heading toward. Julian parked the car right at the edge of the clearing near the start of the pond. He and Carolyn got out, walked to the trunk of the car, and grabbed their picnic supplies. They set up a blanket right on the edge of the water, looking up at the waterfall, and spent about an hour eating their lunch, talking, and enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. By around 2:30 p.m., they realized that they needed to start packing up. They had told both of their families that they would be back home by 3 p.m., and they wanted to make sure they were punctual. They gathered their picnic blanket, the leftover food, and their container, walked back to the car, and placed everything in the trunk. They got back into the front seats, and Julian started the engine. He turned the car around in the clearing and began driving back down the bumpy dirt road that had brought them in. As they were traveling down the road, Julian remembered the strange animal carcass he had seen on the drive in, and his curiosity got the better of him. He decided he really wanted to stop and get a closer look at it. He looked over at Carolyn and asked if she minded if he stopped the car when they reached the spot where the roadkill was so he could get out and inspect it. Carolyn looked at him, feeling a little impatient, and told him that it was fine, but she reminded him that they had promised their families they would be back by 3 p.m. She urged him to be as quick as possible. Julian smiled, told her it would not take long at all, and continued driving while scanning the sides of the road. But after driving for several minutes, Julian had not spotted the carcass. The road began to look very familiar, and he started to worry that he had somehow driven right past the spot without realizing it. He stopped the car right there in the middle of the narrow dirt road. They were actually quite close to the end of the dirt track, almost back to the main property where Julian's house was. Julian turned to Carolyn and explained that he must have missed the spot. He asked her if she minded if he just hopped out of the car and jogged back down the road to find it. Carolyn was openly annoyed at this point because this quick look at some roadkill was turning into a time-consuming detour, but she sighed and told him to go ahead. She reiterated that he had to be extremely fast because it was almost 3 p.m. Julian grinned at her, put the car in park, left the engine running, and stepped out of the vehicle. He turned and began jogging back down the dirt road in the direction of the waterfall. After jogging for about 30 seconds, the road made a sharp turn to the right. Once Julian went around this bend, he was completely out of sight. From the car, Carolyn would not be able to see him, and he could no longer see the car. He was surrounded by the thick, towering trees of the forest. Julian knew the road was not incredibly long, so he figured the carcass had to be just around this bend. He decided he would jog for another minute or two, and if he did not find it by then, he would give up and run back to the car. He kept moving, and sure enough, after about a minute of jogging, he spotted the large shape on the side of the road. As he approached, he saw that it was indeed a very large animal carcass lying in the brush. A large leafy branch from a tree had fallen over it, partially obscuring the animal from view. Julian realized that this was why he had missed it on the drive back. The branch had blocked it from his line of sight when coming from the opposite direction. He stood over the shape, still unable to identify what kind of creature it was. Curious, he reached down with his hands and grabbed the tree branch to pull it away so he could get a clear view of the dead animal. But right as he lifted the branch, Julian heard a sudden, sharp sound of movement directly behind him. Before he could even turn his head around to see what was there, something heavy and hard struck him with immense force in the back of the head. Instantly, everything went completely black. Back in the parked car, Carolyn sat in the passenger seat and waited. She looked down at her watch and realized that the time was ticking closer and closer to 3 p.m. Julian had been gone for several minutes, and there was still no sign of him. Feeling increasingly annoyed, she sat up straight and turned around to look out the rear window. She expected to see Julian running back down the road toward the car, waving his hands and apologizing for taking so long. But when she looked out, the dirt road was completely empty. It just stretched back into the distance before curving out of sight behind the thick trees. There was absolutely no sound except for the idling of the car engine and the wind rustling through the leaves. She turned back around, feeling frustrated, and decided to give him another minute. She kept her eyes on the side mirror, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. But as the minutes dragged on, her frustration began to morph into genuine worry. Julian was a very punctual person who respected her time and his family's schedule. It was extremely unlike him to just disappear like this and ignore the time. She began to wonder if he had tripped and hurt himself, or if something else was wrong. Finally, she decided she could not just sit there waiting anymore. It was past 3 p.m., and she needed to find out what was taking him so long. Carolyn opened the passenger door, stepped out onto the dusty ground, and stood up. She closed the door behind her and turned to look down the road toward the bend where Julian had disappeared. But as she took a step forward, she suddenly froze. Standing right in the middle of the dirt road, only a short distance away from her, was something that her brain simply could not process. It was a person, but they were dressed entirely in black from head to toe. They were wearing a dark, tight balaclava over their face, completely obscuring their features. The figure was standing perfectly still, staring directly at her. Carolyn felt a wave of cold terror wash over her. Every instinct told her to turn around, jump back into the car, lock the doors, and drive away. She wanted to scream for help, but her throat felt completely tight. She was utterly paralyzed by fear, unable to move a single muscle as she stared at the silent, masked figure. And then, after a few agonizing seconds of silence, the figure in the road began to move quickly and aggressively directly toward her. By 3:30 p.m. that afternoon, Julian's mother was back at the family home on the main property. She looked at the clock and realized that her son and Carolyn had not returned from their picnic. This immediately struck her as very unusual. Julian was incredibly responsible and always made sure to be home when he said he would be. She walked out onto the front porch, thinking that she would see their car pulling up the long driveway at any moment. She sat on the porch and waited for about 30 minutes, but the property remained completely quiet, and there was no sign of the car. Her concern quickly grew into deep anxiety. She decided to walk down the long driveway toward the main road that bordered the front of their property. To get to the waterfall clearing, Julian would have had to drive out of the main property, travel down this paved public road for a short distance, and then turn onto the specific dirt road that led into the forested acreage. Julian's mother stood at the edge of her driveway, looking down the main road, hoping to see the family car driving toward her. As she stood there, scanning the area, her eyes caught something strange on the chain-link fence that ran along the front border of their land. Jammed tightly through one of the metal gaps in the chain-link fence was a clear plastic bottle. It seemed completely out of place. There was no reason for a random bottle to be wedged into their fence. Curiously, she walked over to the fence and pulled the bottle out. When she held it up, she realized that there was a piece of white paper that had been tightly rolled up and placed inside the bottle. She quickly unscrewed the plastic cap, turned the bottle upside down, and shook it until the rolled-up paper slid out into her hand. She unrolled the paper, and as her eyes scanned the words written on it, her heart began to race violently. She gasped and covered her mouth in absolute horror. The note was written in terrible handwriting with awful spelling and grammar, but the message it conveyed was chillingly clear. It was covered in strange, hand-drawn symbols that appeared to be satanic or occultic in nature. The note stated that the boy and the girl, referring to Julian and Carolyn, had been taken. It warned the family in no uncertain terms that they were being watched, and that if they contacted the police, Julian and Carolyn would be harmed or killed. The note claimed that if the family remained silent and did not involve the authorities, the teenagers would eventually be returned to them. There was no demand for money, no ransom amount listed, and no specific instructions on how to get them back. It was just a direct, terrifying threat. Julian's mother was absolutely terrified. She was caught in a horrifying dilemma. The note explicitly warned her not to call the police, but she knew that her young son and his girlfriend were out there in the hands of someone dangerous. Despite the threats, she decided that she could not handle this alone, and she immediately called the police to report that Julian and Carolyn had been kidnapped. When the police arrived at the property, they took the situation incredibly seriously. They secured the plastic bottle and the note as evidence and began examining them. What immediately caught the investigators' attention was a set of initials written at the very bottom of the threatening note. The initials were O-N-A. The police officers and investigators began researching these initials in connection with the strange satanic symbols drawn all over the paper. It did not take them long to discover that ONA stood for the Order of Nine Angles. This was a notorious, self-professed satanic cult. While the cult had originally been founded and operated primarily in the United Kingdom and other parts of Europe, it also had active, secretive chapters in the United States, Canada, Russia, and as it turned out, Australia. The Order of Nine Angles was not just a passive religious group, they held extremely radical and dangerous beliefs. The cult viewed traditional Christianity as a major enemy of the world that needed to be completely dismantled. Their ultimate goal was to establish a militaristic, authoritarian new world order that they referred to as the Imperium. Even more disturbing to the police was the fact that the Order of Nine Angles openly advocated for and admitted to practicing human sacrifice. According to their own literature and beliefs, they believed in sacrificing individuals whom they deemed to be lesser or who actively opposed their worldview. To a group like this, Julian and Carolyn, two young devout Christians who were highly active in their local church, would be seen as the ultimate enemies and the perfect candidates for a sacrificial ritual. Initially, when the police first looked at the note and connected it to this obscure cult, some investigators wondered if this was all just an elaborate, sick prank. Julian and Carolyn had only been missing for a couple of hours, and the idea of an international satanic cult operating in the rural bushland of southern Australia and kidnapping local teenagers seemed almost too wild to be true. But then Carolyn's parents arrived at the scene, and they delivered a piece of information that completely shattered any theory of a simple prank. Carolyn's parents revealed to the police that exactly 10 days prior, they had received a very strange letter in their mailbox. When they opened it, they found a sheet of paper covered in the exact same bizarre hand-drawn satanic symbols. The letter had made no sense to them at the time. It was filled with vague threats warning them not to go to the police, but because they had no reason to involve the police back then, and because they did not know anyone who would want to harm them, they had simply dismissed it as a weird piece of junk mail or a joke. They had put it away and forgotten about it. But now, with Julian and Carolyn missing and a near-identical note found on the Buckwald property, the situation looked incredibly grim. The presence of the first letter proved that whoever was behind this had been planning the abduction for at least 10 days. It meant that someone had been actively stalking both families, watching their homes, and tracking the teenagers' movements before launching a coordinated, premeditated attack. This was not a random crime of opportunity. It was a highly planned, sophisticated kidnapping. That very evening, the local police launched a massive, coordinated search operation. They brought in search dogs, ground crews, and helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras to scour every single inch of the Buckwald's 1,200 acres of land. They searched the dense brush, the rocky terrain, and the area around the waterfall, looking for any sign of a struggle, a dropped item, or a vehicle. But despite their extensive efforts, they found absolutely nothing. The forest was completely silent, and there was no trace of Julian or Carolyn. Over the next several days, the search continued, but the leads quickly began to dry up. There were no further notes left in bottles, no phone calls, and no ransom demands. The police monitored the local area and reached out to federal authorities to investigate any known members or sympathizers of the Order of Nine Angles in Australia, but they hit wall after wall. The community was gripped by fear, and the families of the two teenagers were living in a state of constant, agonizing dread. As the days ticked by with zero contact and no new clues, the investigators privately began to prepare themselves for the worst. They feared that Julian and Carolyn had already fallen victim to a horrific ritual and that they would never be seen alive again. Then, on March 11th, 7 days after the teenagers had vanished, something entirely unexpected happened. Deep in the mountainous and rugged terrain near Alpine National Park, which is located about 250 miles north of Budgery, a local farmer was driving his truck along a winding, isolated back road. The area was incredibly remote, surrounded by vast stretches of dense forest and steep hills. As the farmer rounded a curve, he tapped his brakes in surprise. Up ahead on the shoulder of the road, two young people were stumbling out from the thick tree line. They were barely wearing any clothes, and they looked incredibly weak, disoriented, and exhausted. They were practically crawling onto the gravel at the side of the road. The farmer immediately pulled his truck over, rolled down his window, and called out to them, asking if they were okay and if they needed help. The young man and woman looked up, squinting in the bright light, and began to slowly and painfully stumble toward his vehicle. As they reached the side of the truck, they introduced themselves as Julian and Carolyn. They desperately pleaded with the farmer to help them, telling him that they had been kidnapped and had been lost in the wilderness for days. The farmer, shocked by their appearance and their story, quickly helped them climb into his truck. He turned on the heater, gave them what little water he had, and drove as fast as he could to the nearest hospital. As soon as they arrived at the medical facility, the hospital staff alerted the local police, who in turn contacted the investigators back in Budgery. The news that Julian and Carolyn had been found alive sent a shockwave of relief through their families and the entire community. Investigators immediately jumped into their cars and drove the long distance north to the hospital near Alpine National Park. When the detectives arrived, they first spoke with the attending doctors to assess the teenagers' physical condition. The doctors explained that both Julian and Carolyn were severely traumatized and in a state of shock. They were suffering from extreme sunburns, and their bodies were covered in deep scratches, bruises, and hundreds of painful insect bites. They were dehydrated and exhausted, but thankfully they had no life-threatening injuries and were expected to make a full physical recovery. Once the doctors gave the clear, the detectives stepped into the hospital room where Julian and Carolyn were resting. The police knew that the teenagers had just been through an incredibly traumatic ordeal, but they also knew that time was of the essence. If there was a dangerous armed kidnapper or a group of cult members hiding out in the rugged forests of Alpine National Park, they needed to get details immediately so they could launch an arrest operation. They sat down with Julian and Carolyn separately to take their official statements. The two teenagers cooperated fully, and they independently laid out a detailed, harrowing account of what had happened to them over the past 7 days. According to Julian's statement, on the afternoon of March 4th, he had jogged back down the dirt road on his family's property to find the strange animal carcass. When he found it, he noticed a large branch obscuring it, so he reached down to pull the branch away. The moment he did, he heard a sudden rustling behind him. He started to turn his head, but before he could see who it was, someone struck him with a heavy object in the back of the head, knocking him out instantly. Julian told police that when he finally regained consciousness, he was completely disoriented. He quickly realized that a significant amount of time had passed because the sun had set and it was pitch black outside. He was shivering violently because he had been completely stripped of his clothes. He tried to move his hands and feet, only to find that his wrists and ankles had been bound tightly with rope, and he was secured to the trunk of a large tree in the middle of a dense, unfamiliar forest. He lay there in the dark, terrified, calling out for help, but there was no response. Then, as he was wriggling against the ropes, his hand brushed against something cold and metallic buried under the fallen leaves on the ground next to him. He carefully investigated with his fingers and realized it was a knife. Julian told the officers that he could not believe his luck. He managed to manipulate his bound hands to grip the handle of the knife, and he slowly and painstakingly cut through the ropes around his ankles and waist. Once his legs were free, he managed to cut the bindings on his wrists. Free from his restraints, but completely naked and freezing, Julian knew he had to run. He did not know if his attacker was watching him from the darkness or if they would return at any moment. He grabbed the knife for protection and began running blindly through the dark woods, hoping to find a road or some sign of civilization. Meanwhile, Carolyn gave her own terrifying account of the abduction. She told the detectives that after waiting in the car for Julian, she had stepped out onto the dirt road to look for him. As she stood by the door, she saw a man standing in the road about 10 feet away. He was dressed entirely in black and wearing a balaclava. Before she could scream or run, the man sprinted toward her and tackled her violently to the ground. She struggled, but the man was much stronger than her. He proceeded to rip all of her clothes off, leaving her completely naked. He then used rope to bind her wrists and ankles together behind her back, putting her in a painful hogtied position. He tied a tight blindfold over her eyes so she could see absolutely nothing. Carolyn lay on the dirt road, shivering and crying as she heard her attacker run back down the road. A few minutes later, she heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. It stopped right next to her. She heard a car door open, and then rough hands picked her up from the ground and shoved her into the tight, dark trunk of the car. The trunk was slammed shut, and the vehicle sped away. Carolyn described the journey as an absolute nightmare. She lay in the trunk for hours as the car twisted and turned. The ropes were tied so tightly that the circulation to her hands and feet was cut off, causing agonizing, shooting pains to course through her limbs. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she felt the car turn onto a very rough, bumpy dirt track. Shortly after, the car came to a complete stop. She heard the driver's door open and close, followed by footsteps walking toward the back of the vehicle. The trunk lid popped open, and the attacker reached in and pulled the blindfold off her eyes. Her eyes struggled to adjust to the dim light, but she could see the silhouette of the man in the black balaclava. He reached in, grabbed her, and pulled her out of the trunk, letting her drop heavily onto the ground. He then grabbed her by her bound wrists and began dragging her naked body across the rough forest floor deeper into the dark woods. Carolyn was terrified that she was about to be executed. After dragging her for several minutes, the man dropped her onto the dirt. He walked back toward the car and returned, holding a shovel. He made a deliberate point of holding the shovel right in front of her face so she could see it clearly. He then rolled her onto her side so that she was forced to watch him. Right there in front of her, under the dim light of the night sky, the masked man began digging a large hole in the ground. Carolyn lay there in absolute terror for hours, watching the dirt fly as the man dug deeper and deeper. She was convinced that he was digging her grave and that as soon as he was finished, he was going to kill her and bury her body where no one would ever find it. When the hole was finally deep enough, the man climbed out, tossed the shovel aside, and walked over to Carolyn. He picked her up and threw her body into the bottom of the deep hole. Carolyn was waiting for the fatal blow, but instead, she heard the sound of the man walking away. The hole was deep enough that she could not see over the edge, but she could hear his footsteps fading into the distance. She managed to wriggle herself onto her knees at the bottom of the pit, and she began to pray out loud, begging God to save her life. It was during this time, as she was kneeling in the dirt and praying, that she suddenly heard a voice calling out in the distance. It was a voice she recognized. It was Julian. Julian told the police that as he was running through the dark, freezing forest, he had been shouting Carolyn's name, desperately hoping she was nearby. He heard a faint voice crying out in response. He followed the sound through the thick brush and trees until he came upon the deep hole in the clearing. He looked down and saw Carolyn lying there, naked and bound. Julian quickly jumped into the hole, used the knife he had found to cut her ropes, and helped her climb out of the pit. Carolyn's legs were so numb from the loss of circulation that she could barely stand, let alone walk. Julian held her up, wrapping his arms around her, and they slowly began to move away from the clearing. But as they were preparing to flee, they noticed something lying on the ground near a tree just outside the clearing. It was a sleeping bag, and rolled up inside of it was a small stash of food and water bottles. They could not understand why their attacker would leave these life-saving items behind, but they were in no position to ask questions. They grabbed the sleeping bag, the food, and the water, and they fled deeper into the wilderness. For the next 48 hours, the young couple endured pure misery. During the day, the intense Australian sun beat down on them. Since they had no clothes, they had no protection from the harsh UV rays, and their skin began to burn and blister. They had to walk through thick, thorny brush that scratched their bare skin, and they were constantly swarmed by mosquitoes and biting insects. At night, the temperature in the mountains plummeted, leaving them freezing. They had to huddle together inside the single sleeping bag, shivering violently and sharing the small amount of food and water they had. They kept walking, hoping to find a road or a hiking trail, but to their absolute horror, at the end of those 48 hours, they realized they had been walking in a giant circle. They stumbled right back into the exact same clearing where the hole had been dug. However, this apparent setback turned out to be a miracle. As they looked around the clearing, they noticed a large backpack propped up against a tree that had definitely not been there before. They cautiously walked over and opened it. Inside, they found more food, several bottles of water, a set of basic clothing, and a detailed map of the surrounding area. They quickly put on the clothes, ate some of the food, and drank the water. Using the map, they were able to orient themselves and figure out which direction they needed to walk to find civilization. For the next 5 days, they hiked through the rugged terrain, following the map as best as they could, until they finally reached the winding back road where the farmer spotted them. The police listened to this incredible story of survival and abduction, and they knew they had to act fast. They organized a massive search team to head deep into the forests of Alpine National Park, targeting the area where Carolyn had been held. They wanted to find the clearing, the hole, and any physical evidence that the kidnapper might have left behind. It did not take long for the search teams to locate the exact clearing. The deep hole was still there, exactly as Carolyn had described. And near the hole, the police found several items left behind by the attacker. The shovel used to dig the pit, lengths of rope, and a roll of heavy-duty duct tape. The items were carefully bagged and sent back to the forensic laboratory for urgent analysis. The detectives hoped that they would find fingerprints or DNA that would lead them to a known member of the Order of Nine Angles or another suspect. But when the forensic results came back a short time later, the investigators were absolutely stunned by what they found. The shovel, the rope, and the duct tape did not belong to some mysterious cult member. The police were able to trace the purchase and ownership of these exact items, and they discovered that every single one of them belonged to Julian Buchwald. The investigators sat in their office looking at the forensic reports in complete disbelief. This discovery changed everything. If the shovel used to dig Carolyn's grave and the rope used to bind her belonged to Julian, it meant one of two things. Either the kidnapper had somehow broken into Julian's home and stolen his tools prior to the abduction, or Julian himself had brought those items to the forest. The police knew that the first theory was highly unlikely. Why would a sophisticated cult group go to the trouble of stealing a specific shovel and rope from their victim's house when they could easily buy their own? The evidence pointed to a much more disturbing reality. Julian was somehow involved in his own kidnapping, and the entire story they had been told was a lie. The detectives decided they needed to confront Julian immediately. They went back to the hospital, separated him from his family and Carolyn, and brought him into an interview room. They laid out the forensic evidence on the table in front of him. They told him flat out that they knew the shovel, the rope, and the tape belonged to him. They pushed him for answers, demanding to know how his personal items ended up at a crime scene 250 miles away from his home. Initially, Julian tried to stick to his story. He claimed that he had no idea how those items got there and suggested that the attacker must have taken them from his family's property. But the detectives did not buy it. They put intense pressure on him, pointing out the inconsistencies in his timeline and the sheer statistical impossibility of his story. Under the weight of the evidence and the relentless questioning, Julian's confident facade began to crack. Finally, he broke down and confessed to the entire thing. It turns out there was never any satanic cult. The Order of Nine Angles had absolutely nothing to do with the disappearance of Julian and Carolyn. The entire kidnapping, the threats, the survival ordeal, and the search had been meticulously planned and executed by Julian himself. Julian explained to the police exactly how he had pulled off this incredibly elaborate hoax. The plan had started weeks before the actual abduction. Julian had become increasingly obsessed with the idea of having physical intimacy with Carolyn. Because of their strict religious beliefs and their commitment to wait until marriage, Carolyn had made it very clear that she would not engage in any sexual activity before they were wed, but their wedding was still a year away, and Julian decided that he simply could not wait that long. He came up with a bizarre, highly manipulative scheme to force her into a situation where she would feel she had no choice but to give in to his advances. Days before March 4th, Julian had driven up to Alpine National Park on his own. He selected the remote clearing, dug the deep hole using his own shovel, and stashed the backpack filled with food, water, clothing, and the map nearby. He also stashed a sleeping bag, some basic provisions, and his black attacker outfit, which included the balaclava, ropes, and duct tape, closer to his family's property in Budgeree. He then wrote the threatening notes. He researched the Order of Nine Angles online, drew their satanic symbols on the paper, and signed them with the initials ONA to create a massive, terrifying distraction that would point the police in the completely wrong direction. He mailed the first note to Carolyn's parents 10 days before the attack to set the stage and make the threat feel real and established. On the day of the picnic, everything went exactly as Julian had planned. The story of the large, strange roadkill on the side of the road was completely made up. Julian had fabricated it on the drive in solely to give himself an excuse to stop the car and walk back alone on the return trip. When he ran back around the bend out of Carolyn's sight, there was no attacker waiting for him. Julian had simply run to his hidden stash of gear. He did not get hit on the head. He had deliberately rubbed dirt and leaves on himself to look like he had been in a struggle. He then dressed in the all-black clothing and put on the balaclava. He walked back to the car where Carolyn was waiting. Seeing her standing outside the vehicle made things even easier for him. He charged at her, tackled her to the ground, and stripped her of her clothes to make her feel completely vulnerable and exposed. He bound her wrists and ankles, blindfolded her, and locked her in the trunk of his own car. Julian then drove his car for 6 hours, heading north to Alpine National Park. When he arrived at the remote location, he dragged Carolyn into the woods, showed her the shovel to terrify her into believing she was about to be murdered, and threw her into the pre-dug pit. Once she was in the hole and could not see him, Julian walked away, stripped off his black outfit, and hid it. He then walked back toward the clearing, completely naked except for the knife he had stashed. He began shouting for help, making it seem like he had just escaped his own captivity. He cut Carolyn free, pretended to find the sleeping bag and food by sheer luck, and led her into the forest. The entire 7-day survival ordeal was a calculated psychological game. Julian knew exactly where they were the entire time. He had intentionally walked Carolyn in a circle to return to the pit so they could retrieve the backpack with the map and clothes that he had hidden there beforehand. The primary goal of this entire nightmarish charade was to get Carolyn into the single sleeping bag with him. During the freezing cold nights in the mountains, Julian would huddle close to her inside the bag. He would look at her and tell her that the temperature was dropping to dangerous levels and that they were going to freeze to death if they did not generate body heat. He told her that the only way they could survive the night was to have sex. He even tried to convince her that since they were in a life or death situation, they could say their marriage vows to each other right there in the woods, and in the eyes of God, they would be married, making the physical intimacy acceptable. But despite her sheer terror, the freezing cold, and Julian's relentless manipulation, Carolyn stood firm. Every single night, she flatly refused his advances and insisted that they keep their distance, preferring to endure the cold rather than break her vows. After 7 days of sleeping in the wilderness and failing to coerce her, Julian realized his plan had completely failed. He knew he could not keep her out there forever without risking her life from exposure or dehydration, so he finally used the map to lead her to the back road where they were rescued. The police were absolutely horrified by Julian's confession. They immediately arrested him and charged him with kidnapping, false imprisonment, and a series of other serious offenses. The news of his arrest sent shockwaves through the community and devastated Carolyn and her family, who realized that the boy they had trusted and welcomed into their home was actually a master manipulator who had put Carolyn through a week of psychological torture. While Julian was out on bail awaiting his trial, he realized the gravity of the charges against him and the high likelihood of a lengthy prison sentence. He decided to make a run for it. In another bizarre, desperate move, Julian attempted to alter his appearance to flee the country. He used tanning lotion to dye his skin a much darker shade and dyed his hair black. He managed to obtain a fraudulent Indian passport and booked a flight to India. Surprisingly, his disguise was convincing enough to get him past the initial security checkpoints in Australia, and he successfully boarded a plane and flew to India. But his freedom was short-lived. The moment he landed at the airport in India, immigration authorities noticed inconsistencies with his travel documents. They detained him, and a quick check of international databases revealed his true identity and the fact that he was a wanted fugitive from Australia. He was immediately arrested and extradited back to his home country to face justice. In 2009, Julian Buchwald stood trial for his crimes. The prosecution presented the overwhelming forensic evidence, Julian's detailed confession, and the heartbreaking testimony of Carolyn, who had to relive the terror of being tackled, stripped, and thrown into a grave by the man she had loved. The jury found Julian guilty of kidnapping, and he was sentenced to 7 years and 9 months in prison. The aftermath of the case left a deep, lingering scar on the community, and especially on Carolyn and her family. Carolyn was left to deal with the immense psychological trauma of the event, struggling to understand how someone who claimed to love her and share her deeply held religious values could subject her to such a horrific, calculated ordeal. The physical injuries healed, but the emotional scars of that week in the Australian wilderness and the ultimate betrayal by her fiancé would remain with her for the rest of her life. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Every single day, we make hundreds of small, seemingly insignificant decisions. We choose what to eat for breakfast, what road to take on our commute, what book to read before bed, or whether to strike up a casual conversation with a stranger on the bus. Most of the time, these little choices fade into the background of our lives, completely forgotten by the time we wake up the next morning. But every once in a while, one of those tiny, routine decisions sets off a massive, unstoppable chain reaction. A single choice, made in a split second of boredom, desperation, or simple curiosity, can completely reshape a person's life forever. And sometimes it does not just change their own life, it changes the lives of millions and millions of other people all around the globe. Today, we are going to look at 3 normal, everyday people who found themselves standing at these exact crossroads. They made choices that felt completely ordinary at the time, but those decisions ended up sending shockwaves through history, pop culture, and global politics. Our first story begins on a cold, gray afternoon in the year 2009 inside a quiet, dimly lit manga cafe in the bustling city of Seoul, South Korea. A 38-year-old man named Hwang Dong-huk was sitting in a small private wooden booth staring blankly at the wall. A manga cafe is a very popular place in South Korea where people can go to escape the noise and stress of the city. You can buy cheap snacks, sip on hot drinks, and browse through massive floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with thousands of manga volumes, which are essentially Japanese comic books. It is a place designed for quiet comfort and cheap relaxation, but on this particular day, Hwang Dong-hyuk was anything but relaxed. The truth was, he was completely broke. He did not have enough money to buy a cup of coffee or a small snack from the cafe counter. He had only come inside because it was a warm, quiet place to sit and escape the harsh, unforgiving reality of his daily life. At 38 years old, his life was in complete shambles. For his entire adult life, he had dreamed of becoming a successful writer and film director. He had spent years studying the craft, working long hours on various movie sets, and trying to get his scripts noticed by major production companies. He had successfully landed a few small temporary jobs here and there, writing a script or directing a minor project, but the entertainment industry in Seoul was incredibly competitive and unpredictable. Every single time he thought he was finally making progress, the project would suddenly fizzle out, the funding would dry up, and he would find himself right back where he started, completely unemployed. At this point in his life, he was completely out of options and drowning in debt. He lived in a tiny, cramped apartment with his elderly mother and his grandmother. Even though all three of them pooled every single penny they had, they still struggled to pay their monthly rent and keep the heating on. The financial stress was absolutely crushing, hanging over him like a dark cloud. Just a few weeks prior, Hwang had been forced to make a heart-wrenching decision. He had to sell his laptop, which was his most prized possession, and the only tool he had to write his scripts. He sold it for a fraction of what it was worth, just so his family would not get evicted onto the cold streets. To make matters worse, he had started taking out short-term, high-interest loans just to buy basic necessities like white rice and medicine. He had absolutely no way of paying them back, and the debt was piling up like a mountain, with predatory debt collectors constantly calling his phone. The anxiety was so intense that he could barely sleep. The only way he could find even a temporary moment of peace was to escape into the world of manga. So, on this afternoon, he went to the cafe's library shelves, searched through the volumes, and pulled down a copy of his absolute favorite manga series. It was a highly controversial and incredibly violent survival story called Battle Royale. The story follows a class of high school students who are forced by a ruthless authoritarian government to fight each other to the death on a deserted island until only one survivor remains. The manga was notorious for its graphic violence and dark psychological themes, but to Hwang it was a masterpiece. It was so over-the-top and dramatic that it allowed him to completely forget about his own miserable life, if only for an hour. As he sat in his booth, turning the pages and reading the story for the 20th time, a sudden thought struck him. He looked at the pages, showing characters fighting for survival, and then he thought about his own desperate situation. He thought about the crushing weight of his debt, the feeling of absolute hopelessness, and the sheer desperation that consumed him every single day. He realized that there were millions of people in South Korea and all over the world who were experiencing this exact same kind of financial desperation. And then he had a massive epiphany. What if he wrote a story that combined the extreme high-stakes survival elements of Battle Royale with the harsh modern reality of extreme poverty? He started thinking about his childhood, playing innocent street games like the Squid Game, Red Light, Green Light, and the Dalgona Candy Challenge with his friends. Back then, the only stakes were who got to be the king of the playground. But what if, instead of high school students forced to fight by a government, the story was about ordinary, deeply indebted adults who willingly signed up to play these innocent childhood games for a massive cash prize? They would know that losing meant death, but their real lives were already such a living hell that they were willing to take the risk. The idea was so brilliant and so raw that it made his hands shake. He did not have his laptop anymore, but he had a cheap pen and some scraps of paper. He leaned over the table in his booth and began to write furiously. He sketched out characters, came up with ideas for different games, and outlined a complex, dark narrative about human nature and greed. He wrote for hours and hours, completely losing track of time. By the time the cafe manager tapped on his shoulder to tell him they were closing, Huang had a complete, detailed outline of a brand new world. Over the next several months, Huang worked tirelessly to turn this outline into a full, polished script. He had to write much of it by hand on yellow legal pads, but he poured his entire soul into it. He was absolutely convinced that this script was his masterpiece, the one project that would finally pull his family out of poverty. But when he finally finished the script and began pitching it to investors and production studios, his dreams were completely shattered. Every single buyer he met with rejected it immediately. They told him the script was way too weird, far too dark, and completely unrealistic. They said that a story about desperate people murdering each other in children's games was too grotesque for television and that no mainstream audience would ever want to watch it. For 10 long years, Huang Dong-hook carried that script with him everywhere he went. He remained broke, his family continued to struggle, and he was forced to take on low-paying menial jobs just to survive. He often had to skip meals, and the shame of being unable to support his mother and grandmother ate away at him. But despite all the rejections and the constant self-doubt, he refused to throw the script away. He knew in his gut that the story was powerful, and that people who had experienced real struggle would relate to the themes of desperation and survival. Then, fast forward to the year 2019. Out of nowhere, a major global production studio decided to take a massive gamble. They looked at Huang's script and saw something unique. They bought the rights to the story and put it into production as a high-budget television series. 12 years after Huang Dong-hyuk had sat in that manga cafe, broke and hopeless, his vision was finally brought to life. In September of 2021, the show premiered. Almost overnight, the series became a monumental global phenomenon. It completely dominated the internet, becoming the most-watched show in the history of the streaming platform. It sparked thousands of memes, merchandise lines, and discussions about economic inequality in modern society. The show ultimately generated over $900 million in value for the production company. And as for Huang Dong-hook, his life was changed forever. He was finally able to pay off all his debts, buy a beautiful home for his mother and grandmother, and secure his place as one of the most respected writers and directors in the industry, even winning a prestigious Emmy Award for his direction. The manga series that started it all was Battle Royale, and the global phenomenon that Huang created was called Squid Game. It all happened because a desperate man with no money in his pocket made the simple decision to walk into a cafe and read his favorite comic book. It is truly amazing how a single afternoon in a manga cafe could lead to one of the biggest television shows in human history. But now, let us travel back to a different time and place, to the hot summer of 1953 in the city of Memphis, Tennessee. Inside a small, unassuming brick building on Union Avenue, a 30-year-old man named Sam Phillips was busy cleaning up his recording studio. The studio was called Sun Records, and it was Sam's pride and joy. Memphis was a city bursting with musical energy, a place where gospel, blues, country, and rhythm and blues were constantly blending together on the street corners and in the local clubs. Sam was a deeply passionate music lover who believed that the big, established record labels in New York and Los Angeles were completely out of touch with the raw, authentic music of the American South. He wanted to capture that raw energy, but he did not have the money or the connections to sign big-name acts. So, Sam came up with a very unique and highly unusual business model. He decided to open up his recording studio to absolutely anyone who walked off the street. He set up a policy where anyone could walk into Sun Records at any time, hand him exactly $4, and in exchange, Sam would record them professionally and press their song onto a double-sided acetate disc. Sam hoped that by casting such a wide net, he would eventually find a rare, undiscovered talent, a star that could put his studio on the map. But the reality of this business model was incredibly grueling. Most of the people who paid the $4 were not talented at all. They were amateur singers who sang completely out of key, played their instruments poorly, and left Sam sitting in the control room with a massive headache. On this particular summer afternoon, Sam had just finished recording a local church choir, which had gone reasonably well, and now he was sweeping up the dust, wrapping up heavy microphone cables, and resetting his recording equipment, hoping that someone interesting would walk through the door. And then, the door opened, and an 18-year-old kid walked inside. The kid was dressed in simple work clothes, covered in grease and sweat from his day job, and he had a cheap acoustic guitar slung over his shoulder. Sam had never seen him before, and right away he could tell the kid was incredibly shy. He stood near the entrance, nervously shifting his weight from one foot to the other, barely making eye contact with Sam. The young man walked up to the reception desk and met Sam's assistant, a woman named Marian Keisker. She asked him what kind of singer he was, and the kid replied that he sang all kinds. When she asked who he sounded like, he famously looked down and said that he did not sound like nobody. Sam greeted him warmly and asked how he could help him. The young man cleared his throat and explained in a very soft, polite voice that he worked as a truck driver for a local electrical supply company called Crown Electric. He said that he loved to play the guitar and sing in his spare time, and that he wanted to use the $4 service to record a couple of traditional, slow ballads as a birthday gift for his beloved mother, Gladys. Sam, always welcoming, smiled and told him to step right into the recording booth. The kid handed over his $4, walked into the small booth, and positioned himself in front of the microphone. Sam went back into the control room, put on his headphones, and prepared himself for what he assumed would be a very average, mediocre performance. But the moment the kid struck the first chord on his guitar and began to sing, Sam's jaw practically hit the floor. The transformation was absolute. The incredibly shy, awkward teenager who had just been mumbling at the front door completely vanished. In his place was an artist of unbelievable depth and power. His voice was incredibly rich, warm, and filled with a deep, soulful emotion that seemed far beyond his 18 years. He sang the slow ballads with perfect control and a hauntingly beautiful tone that filled the entire studio. Sam sat in the control room, completely paralyzed, listening to this truck driver sing. He knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he was listening to someone truly extraordinary. When the recording was finished, the young man stopped singing, and just like that, the magic vanished. He instantly reverted back to being a shy, polite teenager. He stepped out of the booth, thanked Sam quietly, took his newly pressed acetate disc, and walked out into the hot Memphis sun. Once the kid was gone, Sam sat in the silence of his studio, his heart racing. He reached for his notepad where he kept track of the people who came into the studio, and he wrote down a quick, urgent note to himself. It read, "Good ballad singer. Save." He knew he had to keep this kid in mind for the future. Fast forward to the summer of 1954, about a year after that fateful afternoon. Sam was back in the studio, working with a local country music band. They were trying to record a few tracks, but the session was going terribly. The band was talented, but they felt like their instrumental tracks were flat and lacked a strong, defining lead voice to pull everything together. They asked Sam if he knew of any vocalists in the area who might be able to help them. Sam's studio manager, who had been present during the young truck driver session the year before, immediately jumped in. She reminded Sam of the shy 18-year-old who had recorded the ballads for his mother, insisting that his voice was one of the best she had ever heard. Sam agreed and decided to give the young man a call. The kid was thrilled to get the invitation and rushed down to the studio to meet the band. But when they began to play, the session was a complete disaster. The young man was still a fantastic singer, but he and the band had absolutely no chemistry. They had just met, and they were trying to play standard, highly structured country and pop songs. The kid's slow, expressive ballad style did not fit the up-tempo, rigid rhythm of the band at all. It sounded stiff, awkward, and completely lifeless. Sam watched from the control room, feeling the tension rise. After several failed attempts, he could see that everyone was getting frustrated and tired. he decided to call for a quick break to let everyone clear their heads. The band members and the young singer put down their instruments and walked out of the live room to grab a cold drink and step outside. Sam walked into the adjacent control room to sit in silence and try to figure out how to salvage the session. The control room did not have a window looking into the live booth, so he was completely cut off from seeing what was happening in there. But then, through the heavy walls of the studio, Sam heard a faint sound. It turns out that the young singer had gone back into the recording booth alone while the band was still outside. He had picked up his acoustic guitar and started playing an old blues song called That's All Right, which had originally been recorded by an artist named Arthur Crudup. But the kid was not playing it like a traditional blues song. He was playing it incredibly fast, with a driving, bouncing, energetic rhythm that was completely unique. He was tapping on the wood of his guitar, creating a beat that made it impossible not to move. Hearing the upbeat noise, the band members ran back into the booth, grabbed their instruments, and began to play along with him, caught up in the pure, unadulterated joy of the sound. Sam stood up in the control room, his ears ringing with this incredible, loud, kinetic music. He ran out of the control room, threw open the door to the recording booth, and what he saw absolutely took his breath away. The shy, quiet truck driver was leaping around the room, totally lost in the rhythm, strumming his guitar with a wild, infectious energy. His voice was pouring out of him with a raw, electric power, a perfect blend of soulful blues and energetic country swing. It was a sound that Sam had never heard in his entire life, a completely new kind of music that defied any existing genre. Sam stood there with goosebumps covering his arms, realizing that this was the exact sound he had been searching for his entire life. He shouted to the band to keep playing exactly what they were playing, quickly turned on the recording equipment, and captured the track on tape that very night. When the song was played on a local Memphis radio station a few days later, the station was completely flooded with phone calls from listeners demanding to hear it again. The young truck driver became a sensation overnight, launching a career that would completely revolutionize the music industry and pop culture forever. The studio was Sun Records, and the young truck driver who spent $4 to record a song for his mother was none other than Elvis Presley, the future king of rock and roll. It is truly mind-blowing to think that the entire history of rock and roll was set in motion because a young man wanted to make a thoughtful birthday gift for his mother. But our third story takes us to a very different kind of arena, where a single, high-stakes decision in a boxing ring completely transformed a man's reputation and paved his way to leading an entire nation. Our story takes place on the evening of March 31st, 2012, in the city of Ottawa, Canada. Inside a massive, brightly lit convention center, a 40-year-old man named Justin was standing in the corner of a professional boxing ring. The arena was packed to the brim with hundreds of screaming spectators, and television cameras were swooping overhead, broadcasting the event to thousands of viewers across the country. Justin was incredibly nervous. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, and his hands were sweating inside his heavy boxing gloves. This was easily the most important athletic event of his life, but it was also, terrifyingly, the very first time he had ever stepped into a boxing ring for an actual fight. He was a complete amateur, and he knew that his entire reputation and future were on the line. The match was a highly publicized charity event called the Fight for the Cure, designed to raise funds for cancer research. But there was also a massive political rivalry at play. Justin was a young, ambitious member of parliament, and his opponent was a conservative senator. The fight was viewed by the media as a symbolic battle between two opposing political ideologies and personalities. It was a clash between the progressive, young liberal and the older, traditional conservative. Justin looked across the ring and locked eyes with his opponent. His opponent's name was Brass Knuckles Brazil, although his real name was Patrick Brazeau. He was a highly intimidating figure who had served in the Canadian military and held a black belt in karate. He was notorious for possessing an incredibly strong, bone-shattering punch, which is how he had earned the nickname Brass Knuckles Brazil. He was several pounds heavier than Justin, with broad shoulders and a reputation for raw physical aggression. During the pre-fight weigh-in, the contrast between the two men could not have been more obvious. Brass Knuckles Brazil stood there shirtless, showing off his muscular, tattooed physique, looking like a professional gladiator. Justin, on the other hand, looked lean and relatively average, leading the media and the public to completely write him off before the match even started. Almost everyone who was following the fight believed that Brass Knuckles Brazil was going to absolutely destroy Justin. And it was not just because of his opponent's military background and martial arts skills, but because of Justin's own public reputation. To the Canadian public, Justin was viewed as a soft, pampered, and incredibly privileged intellectual. He was the son of a highly famous former prime minister, and most people believed he had lived a life of luxury, completely insulated from any real physical hardship or conflict. He was seen as a lightweight, a handsome and charming man who lacked any real toughness or grit, often dismissed as a mere drama teacher who had stumbled into politics. The idea of him entering a boxing ring against a military veteran was seen as a joke. When Justin had first entered the ring that night, the sports announcers on television did not even try to hide their skepticism. They openly mocked his appearance, his fancy hair, and his bright red boxing trunks. They immediately gave him the mocking nickname of the Shiny Pony, laughing about how quickly he was going to get knocked out by a tough military veteran like Brass Knuckles Brazil. They predicted that the fight would not even last past the first round. But what the announcers and the public did not know was that the Shiny Pony had been training quietly and intensely for months. He had spent hours in local gyms, sweating, lifting weights, and practicing his punches, determined to prove to the world that he was much tougher than his pampered image suggested. He had learned how to take a punch, how to move his feet, and how to maintain his breathing under intense pressure. The bell rang for the first round, and the fight began. Justin, fueled by pure adrenaline, charged across the ring and immediately started throwing wild, heavy punches. But his technique was chaotic, and Brass Knuckles Brazil easily slipped and ducked away from every single blow. And then the counterattack came. Brass Knuckles Brazil stepped forward and began to pummel Justin with brutal, precise force. He landed heavy, painful punches to Justin's ribs, chest, and face. Justin's head snapped back under the impact of the blows, and he quickly found himself completely overwhelmed, bleeding from his nose and mouth, and desperately clinging to his opponent just to stay upright. The heavy gloves of the military veteran felt like blocks of cement hitting his jaw. The announcers on television were practically laughing, calling the match a complete slaughter and mocking Justin for ever thinking he could step into a ring with a real fighter. They commented that the Shiny Pony was about to be sent to the pasture. Justin was in absolute agony, his vision spinning, and he was on the absolute verge of falling to the canvas. His body wanted to give up, and his brain was telling him to lie down and let the pain stop. But right before Brass Knuckles Brazil could land a decisive knockout punch, the bell rang, signaling the end of the first round. Justin stumbled back to his corner, his legs shaking. The ringside medic immediately rushed in to clean the blood off his face, and his coach leaned in, shouting instructions and trying to get him to focus. But Justin could barely hear a word. His head was throbbing, and he was in deep physical shock. But amid all the pain and the roaring of the crowd, a clear, powerful realization came over him. He knew that if he quit now, or if he allowed himself to get easily knocked out in the second round, his public life would be completely over. He would permanently be branded as a joke, a weak, pampered coward who tried to act tough on national television and got humiliated. He knew that the only way to save his reputation was to fight with absolute, reckless abandon. He had to stop trying to box defensively and simply fight for his life. The bell rang for the second round. Justin stood up, wiped the blood from his eyes, and charged back out into the center of the ring. But this time, his energy was completely different. He was fast, relentless, and completely focused. He went straight at Brass Knuckles Brazil, throwing a rapid barrage of heavy punches. And to the absolute shock of everyone in the arena, his punches began to land. He struck Brass Knuckles Brazil with a series of powerful, stinging blows to the head and body. The military veteran was caught completely off guard, expecting Justin to be timid and defeated after the beating he had taken in the first round. Instead, he was facing a man who seemed completely possessed and utterly unafraid of pain. Justin kept moving forward, landing hit after hit, driving his opponent back against the ropes. He used his height advantage to keep the veteran at a distance, landing jab after jab with incredible accuracy. The crowd in the convention center erupted into a deafening roar. The sports announcers were in complete disbelief, shouting into their microphones as the shiny pony completely dominated the round. By the time the bell rang to end the second round, it was Brass Knuckles Brazil who was stumbling back to his corner, gasping for air and looking completely stunned. During the brief rest period, Justin stood in his corner, his chest heaving. He looked across the ring and saw that his opponent was avoiding his gaze, looking exhausted, defeated, and deeply shaken. Justin knew that he had won the mental battle. The bell rang for the third and final round. Justin did not hesitate for a second. He charged across the canvas and unleashed a brutal, unstoppable attack on Brass Knuckles Brazil, landing powerful punches to his face over and over again. Finally, Justin landed a massive, bone-crushing right hook directly to his opponent's nose. The impact was so severe that the man's nose completely shattered and blood began to pour down his face. The referee immediately stepped in, pushed Justin back, and stopped the fight. It was a technical knockout victory. The shiny pony had won the match. The arena went absolutely wild, and the victory became the single biggest news story in Canada the next day. While the fight was officially just a charity event to raise money, the true significance of the match was deeply political. Justin had taken a massive, incredibly risky gamble to completely redefine how the entire nation viewed him. By stepping into the ring against a highly formidable opponent, taking a brutal beating, and fighting his way to a dominant victory through sheer grit and determination, he completely shattered his image as a soft, pampered intellectual. The public now saw him as a tough, resilient, and charismatic fighter who was capable of standing his ground and overcoming impossible odds. They realized that he had played a brilliant strategic game, intentionally letting his opponent wear himself out in the first round before launching his own offensive. Justin used this incredible surge of national popularity and respect to launch a massive political campaign, eventually leading his party to a historic victory and getting elected as the Prime Minister of Canada. His full name is Justin Trudeau, and his opponent in that legendary match was Patrick Brazeau, referred to during the broadcast as Brass Knuckles Brazil. It all started because a man, nicknamed the Shiny Pony, decided to step into a boxing ring to prove to his country that he was a fighter. These three stories, as different as they are, all share a powerful and inspiring truth. They show us that our lives are not completely defined by our current circumstances, no matter how difficult, painful, or hopeless they might seem. A broke writer sitting in a quiet cafe with debt collectors calling his phone, a young truck driver who was far too shy to make eye contact with a stranger, and a politician openly mocked by his entire country as a pampered, weak, lightweight. None of them could have predicted where their simple choices would lead them on that day. But by choosing to take a chance, to step out of their comfort zones, and to push forward through the rejection, the physical pain, and the overwhelming doubt, they completely rewrote their destinies. Their decisions did not just change their own lives, they created iconic art, revolutionary music, and political history that will endure for generations to come. It is a powerful reminder that the smallest, most routine choices we make today might just be the very first step on a massive journey that changes everything. We should never underestimate the power of a single moment or a single decision to transform our world forever. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.